Hello and welcome back to Seed Savers Exchange virtual conference series, Growing Together, Past, Present, and Future. I'm Michael Washburn, the Preservation Director here at Seed Savers Exchange, and I'll be your host for this session. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our community agreements. And so we ask that all participants in Growing Together, past, present, and future, please be respectful, be curious, be patient, speak from your own experiences, and try to avoid jargon, be conscious of intent versus impact, take space and make space, and take care of self. And by embracing these community agreements, we embrace a collective responsibility to create spaces that are respectful, inclusive, and empowering for all. And then before we continue on, I want to take a moment to extend another heartfelt thank you to Decorah Bank and Trust for their generous support for today's virtual conference and their commitment to Seed Savers Exchange, and their hospitality in hosting us is helping us make this event possible. So thank you to Decorah Bank and Trust for being such a generous host. And I am excited to introduce once again Stephen Stresow-Cortez, who will be talking about tending to diversity and how culture shapes garden agroecosystems. Now, Stephen began gardening as a middle schooler in El Paso, Texas, in the heart of the Chihuahuan Desert. So he holds a bachelor's degree and a master's of professional studies degree in horticulture from Cornell University. He is currently a doctoral student and Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Fellow at Michigan State University. His dissertation, Up High, Down Low, Too Slow, Agroecological Nutrient Management and Organic Vegetable Production, takes a bird's eye view of how we grow food, how those growing practices affect soil health, and how we can speed up the agroecological transition. Now, if you have any questions or comments for Stephen, please enter them in the chat. We'd love to hear the questions and comments you have, and we'll share those at the end for a little bit of Q&A with Stephen. And with that, Stephen, my friend, once again, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you to everyone who is joining today. It is great to see all your faces, and super honored to be part of this. I remember, well, I've definitely bought stuff from Seed Savers Exchange before, so I think for me, it's definitely a really big, full circle moment to, have this organization that, has been in my garden and on my plate and in my belly, and now get to speak for. If at any point, you can't hear me, I'm talking too fast, too slow, just let me know in chat. And kind of like Michael said, we'll do a lot of the Q&A at the end. And so, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and start. So the idea of this project, right, tending to diversity, how culture shapes garden agroecosystems. Like Michael said, my name's Steven. I'm a grad student at Michigan State. I do a lot of work, with soil health and soil nutrient management, doing a lot of this, really intense lab, kind of like soil chemistry type stuff. But when we think about, and all that stuff is great, but who's actually, going to use this information, right? What's the goal of all of this scientific research, right? It's to make, our food systems a lot more sustainable, and we do that by working, with people. So this project's going to go through some work we did with the Greater Lansing Food Bank Garden Project. And before I start, I just do want to acknowledge that all this work that we did and Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, Michigan State resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for the historic indigenous communities in Michigan, and for the indigenous individuals and communities who live here now and those who were forcibly removed by their homelands. The reason why I always want to start off with land acknowledgements when you do this work is because of all disciplines. I feel like agriculture is the one that tends to be the most tied to the land, and we have to remember, whose land we're on. And it's an especially contentious issue at land grant institutions because, land grants like MSU, like Cornell, places I've gone to school, um, are seated on indigenous land theft, and we want to, acknowledge that and work towards, making amends. Um, and that's kind of those philosophies came into this project of being a good relative, being a good neighbor, right? So seed of exchange, right? We look at them, we look at the seed catalog, um, and we think about today's theme, like the present. What is currently going on, right? How are we currently saving seed and saving varieties and using varieties? Um, and one of the places we look a lot to is community gardens, right? Where all these things are being grown, especially in urban areas. I'm gonna use Lansing, kind of where I'm from, there's a lot of farmland, a lot of agriculture, tends to be your typical row crops or large scale acreage, or even in an urban area, right? Think of Detroit or the New York City. Where are we getting these biodiversity hotspots? Where are we getting people out there actively managing land and planting crops? A lot of times that happens to be personal or community gardens. So we already know that gardens, and there's been a lot of research, right? Gardens are great places of biodiversity of plants. Um, but this is, and if any of you saw my presentation last year, this is the thing we were kind of hitting at. Um, a garden's just not just a garden, it's a landscape. It's a place where culture is shared and demonstrated. Um, and if we know that, both culture is going to shape gardening and who's gardening there, well, the cultures we belong to are going to shape, what we grow and why we grow and how we grow it. And all this stuff is really interesting because, a lot of places might have their typical tomatoes or peppers or leafy greens, but that's going to change everywhere. Just saying, oh, these community gardens are really diverse. Um, Not every community garden is the same, and that's one of the things we kind of wanted to investigate. Um, so what did we do, right? We went out to 7 community gardens across Lansing, Michigan. I have maps of Michigan, so I'll show you later, but being a visitor to the state, I love how we can, use and I'm sorry, I don't know if this can be inverted or not, but we're kind of smack dab in the middle of the hand. Um, which is really interesting, and really cool. Central Michigan. We work with the Greater Lansing Food Bank, which I'll introduce a little bit more later. But as we were talking to them, one of the really cool things that they do is through all the gardens that they manage is they have a handful of gardens that are specific for like refugee or immigrant gardeners, who they pay special attention to because if you're new to the United States, right, you might have a little bit less resources, or especially when it comes to gardening, you could be coming from a tropical climate. You could be coming, I mean, I'm from Texas, right? Gardening is totally different in Michigan, and that's just within the United States, right? So they have some dedicated staff and dedicated resources to help, these gardeners succeed. So the 7 community gardens that we worked with are ones that the food bank had already said, we're working a lot with these gardens and these gardeners to try and get them culturally relevant produce, to kind of to help them adapt. And we'd be interested, in learning more about what they're doing, what they find useful, what's been helpful to them, ways we can improve. Um, right. And since, there's some language barriers, we wanted to make this project as simple as possible and not take up too much time with the participants. So we asked, simple questions on, can we just catalog what's in your space? What plants are there? Why are you growing them? Um, are there any like cultural or like culinary uses? Sometimes it might be I grow this plant because I like how it tastes, right? That's why I grow my stuff. Or sometimes it's like, oh, I grow this plant because I like it used in this dish, and this dish is a really part of, you know, my culture, or has a certain celebration, tied to it. We're also interested, right? Because a lot of these crops aren't as common. Where are they sourcing seed? The food bank does a lot of work, growing out some transplants, but we found, a lot of kind of like internal seed saving networks. And because to kind of give back to the garden project we're working with, the food bank, what other support do they need, right? The food bank staff can't necessarily talk to every single gardener, But if we're going to design a project where we're investigating this stuff, we want to make sure that our community partners are learning stuff too, right? And why are we doing this work, right? Or why are we interested in um, gardens as cultural and biodiversity hotspots? All the work goes towards supporting food sovereignty, right? There's a lot of definitions and a lot of ideas of what it is, but the main thing is all these definitions center around the idea that people have not just the ability, but the right to define culturally important and accessible food for them, whatever that looks like, right? It's very different from getting enough calories, right? If we look at, um, some stuff in the past. It's not just saying, here's a 50-pound bag of flour and a bag of cheese. There you go. You're not going to go hungry, right? It's saying, well, what food do you like to eat? What food do you want to eat? What food do you eat makes you feel good and like connected to home, or you really enjoy eating, right? And that's what this work of supporting food sovereignty is. Like, this image, right, is an example of like lotus growing in someone's garden, right? It's not easy to be growing lotus flowers in the middle of a university campus, but these people are doing it because they want to be able to eat this crop. And that goes support for doing this. It's not enough to say, oh, here's a garden space, here's some soil, here's some shovel, here's some seeds to grow. It's really working with people to see what they want to grow. Right. So this is the overview of the Greater Lansing Food Bank. And I am, so honored to be able to help volunteer with them and do different things. And they're really holistic, right? You can see on the bottom of the map, they serve, I think, 7 different counties, kind of in mid-Michigan. And they do this through all sorts of things, right? They have partnerships with grocery stores to take off, produce or food that might be close to spoiling that haven't sold. They have, senior programs. They have stuff for people who are moving, to give them some clothes, give them toiletries. They have mobile food pantries. So instead of having people come to a place to get food, right, they have mobile distributions. Some of the stuff we do, right, I'm a grad student. I have a bunch of field plots where we're growing, like an acre of stuff for research. Once we harvest it, we can contact the food bank and they can help, pick that up and then distribute it, community food drives, food rescue, all this stuff, which is really, really amazing. And I'm just part of this one project, which is called the Garden Project. What this project does is, throughout the state, they have 90 different community gardens that reaches, over 10,000, people in Michigan. And as we, see food price of food being more expensive, right? This stuff just becomes especially important. And I think, 975,000 pounds of food in 2022. Vegetables don't weigh a lot. So this is really impressive and does a lot for supplementing food security, helping out, other community organizations, right? So this is kind of a map of where they operate, kind of where they help manage work. This is zooming in a little bit more to kind of Lansing area. And then this is kind of the stuff around the city. You can kind of see where Michigan State University is. I'm not going to disclose the exact location of the gardens. Want to maintain their privacy, but you can kind of get an idea of the spread throughout mid Michigan. Another thing that's important, right, is we think about growing zones. A lot of these growing zones we worked with, right now is 6A. It might have changed a little bit to 6B in the past couple years. Right, but Michigan has really wide range of growing zones and temperatures. Um, and I use, 6A. It's great. We can grow a lot of stuff in the summer. But as we'll find out later on, it's a lot harder for perennials to grow. And especially, I think, yeah, if you're coming from a much warmer area, like myself, still in the continental United States, still 8A, 8B, very different things that you can grow. So these are things you want to be aware of. Right. So how does the Greater Lansing Food Bank Garden Project really reach and specifically target all of their gardeners, but especially, the refugee and the immigrant gardeners? One thing I think is really cool is they have a resource center. So you kind of see this building here. They have a tool shed. So if you think about, I want to start gardening to kind of supplement, my income or reduce my bill at the grocery store. And now you have to buy a shovel, and now you have to buy a rake, and now you have to buy, all this equipment. That's kind of counterintuitive if you're serving a population where the goal is food security, right? So there's a lot of tools and garden books and stuff that people can just borrow for free if you're part of the community garden network. They do a lot of free seed or transplant giveaways. And that's like really nice. And one of the things they've targeted, and they've learned throughout the years, and part of this project was looking at to see, um, there's certain varieties or certain crops that certain, demographics like really want, and they ask, for this crop, especially some stuff. Say it takes like um 6 weeks or it takes several weeks to grow in a greenhouse. That's hard for people to do in an apartment complex or at a house. But if you have a garden center that has a nice greenhouse and has staff who can take care of it, it's a way to get important food into the hands of people. And they also do stuff at the end of the season with, food sharing. They do gardening classes, a lot of really cool work. One of the person we worked with really closely was Stevie Riley. Her position, she's called the New American Engagement Specialist, and she's the one who's out in the field working with these gardeners, figuring out what they want to grow, how they want to grow it, translating a lot of this really great extension material out there. And we are going to hear from Stevie herself. So a really quick pause as we transition to sharing a video. Should just take a couple seconds to pop this in.
Hi, my name is Stevie Riley. I am the New American Engagement Specialist for the Greater Lansing Food Bank's Garden Project. And in that role, I help gardens that have high immigrant and refugee populations in them find culturally relevant seeds. I help grow transplants because most people come from subtropical climates, which is not very friendly in Michigan sometimes. So we grow transplants. I help make sure that they have translated materials for them. I can also help mediate any cultural issues that come up while they're in our gardens.
Awesome. What's your role as a cultural liaison between new Americans and the food they're familiar with?
As cultural liaison, I try to make sure that they have food that they recognize and can grow here in Michigan. A lot of the folks we have are refugees, so they didn't leave their homes voluntarily. So it's a really great thing I can do to help reconnect them with that in something that they might not have thought that they would ever see again.
How does gardening support nutrition security for neighbors as well as cultural connection and familiarity?
Well, as part of, oh, that didn't really help. As part of the food bank, we realized early on that a lot of refugees, new Americans, and international folks don't often recognize some of the foods that we have here in the US, or they don't necessarily trust something that comes from a can. They're used to very different food. So one of the things we can help provide here at Garden Project is connecting them with the fresh produce or things that they might not find in the grocery store or that the food bank is unable to provide.
And why are cultural foods important to addressing food insecurity?
Cultural foods are important to address words. Okay. Cultural foods are very important for addressing food insecurity, especially in refugee and new American populations, because a lot of the foods that we have here in America, they might not be familiar with, either how to eat, how to cook, or just not recognize them at all. So Garden Project allows them the ability to grow it themselves. So they can grow the varieties that are important to them, that are familiar to them, and they can have the fresh produce that they're used to eating.
Great. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you for your patience as we just swap screens really quick. Oops. Okay, does it look like everyone can see my screen now? Thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Right, so yeah, that Steve and I both kind of alluded to like the importance of all of these culturally relevant varieties, which we'll dive into a little bit more later. But what do we find, right? We found 98 unique types of plants grown just across these 7 gardens. With some of the language barriers or some, challenges like, oh, I got this plant from a friend, right? We weren't able to like you would the way you would in a seed catalog, like, oh, this is sun gold tomato, this is beefsteak, this is mortgage lifter, and get the actual name varieties. But we were able to figure out the different, types, for example. So we were able to see like a cherry tomato, a grape tomato, slicing tomato, right? We counted those as like 3 different types of tomatoes. And even though there might have been, say, like a dozen cherry tomatoes, since we couldn't figure that out between each plot, between each gardener, we just kind of have that like generic. But even with that, really generic broad umbrella, 98 different species of plants, right? This is just the eggplants. There was, our typical globe eggplants. We had African eggplants. We had the more slender Japanese eggplants. We had pea eggplants or African eggplants, right? So just eggplants alone, we had this diversity, in what really is just like 10 square miles, which is really cool, right? So let's go back to kind of the themes, right? We kind of put out like different themes that we got through interviews and what the gardeners said. And the first one that was the most prominent is this sense of home, right? People were really intentional about what they planted. And everyone said is like they grew what we want to eat, right? They wouldn't be growing it, they wouldn't be spending the time gardening if it wasn't worthwhile for them to eat. And this example here is some of these little peppers. Each of the it's just thousands and thousands of little peppers that people harvested. And what they did is, well, they really like this pepper. They use it to make hot sauce. They use it in all their dishes. To buy this quantity of peppers at the store would be so expensive. So it allows people to eat, things that they really enjoy without having to incur the cost. Or even using lotus as an example that we saw earlier. Yeah, there's specialty markets in the area that will sell it. But they're telling us, like, yeah, it will be 10 times the amount to buy like a single serving of lotus flowers or even this specialty type of pepper than it would be to just grow it yourself. So there's a lot of targeted focus on like really high value, whether that high value is economical or that sense of home. And this was a quote, right? It was someone's mother who, was probably, a little bit elderly saying, if you don't let me eat peppers, with a meal, she's not going to eat it. And kind of, the gardener was saying like, yeah, growing up, my mom, who immigrated to the United States, always had peppers, always had like really spicy food. So if she's gonna have to, and she didn't want to have to give that up. So that's why her daughter grows all of these great wonderful peppers. Right. They also said, being so far from home, having these plants it just feel really nice, right? This is I'm blanking on the name of it. I have it on later in, but the shisho plant, that purple, leafy, almost basil looking plant, right? If you grow up, think about it, you grow up and see all these plants your entire life, and you move to a new place and you can't see them. That's really disheartening. So having a garden and having a space where you're allowed to grow these is really nice. It's another one. People say, this gardener said, collards are a staple for people from Malawi, right? We love having vegetables. But another way to figure out, who's in this garden is this plant. It's called spider plant, also known as saga. Different from the spider plant as a house plant. And Thomas, if you see, someone that is growing this, they're definitely, they're either really like African cuisine, they're African themselves, and they know that because it's a really common staple. And if they're like, yeah, we substitute this a lot with collard greens, but when we can grow a spider plant, we love to grow it. Second kind of theme, we kind of group this under environmental interaction. And I'm sure many of us gardeners have dealt with animals and other people enjoying our produce. But I think the main takeaway was somebody said, animals are good gardeners too. And this was in reference to a raccoon that would come into the garden plots, dig up the potatoes, see that they were green, see that they were a little bit toxic, and say, you know what? I'm not going to eat these, right? But the gardeners were always upset because, now these critters are, negatively impacting their harvest. But even though that's happening, they can just appreciate, wow, you know what? These animals are smart. Like they can tell that these potatoes aren't ripe yet, and they're just going to leave them there. A lot of people left a lot of flowers, either intentionally saying, I have these marigolds, I have these nasturtiums, so that I can bring pollinators to the garden. I can have, multi-uses for it. Or if any volunteer plants came up, someone said, if this plant is going to survive the winter, it'll come up from seed, why am I going to be the one? This plant went through all this work. Why am I going to be the one to pull up this nasturtium? Um, right. And this is just kind of like an example of all these nice, pollinator plants, and kind of this diversity in the same place. A lot of people wanted to do stuff for like visual blocks or visual deterrents. So a lot of people would have corn kind of on the outside of your plot, to hide, or beans or something that could be trellised, a lot of like visual deterrents to hopefully, if a deer or an animal, someone sees that, they don't think that there's other stuff, beyond that corn, right? Another thing that I thought was really awesome was this theme idea of using the entire plant, right? Like a lot of times we'll grow a plant for the edible fruit, right? For like a pepper, we want to eat the pepper, or for squash or a pumpkin, we want to eat the squash or the pumpkin. Um, and this really kind of changed the way I looked at food security a little bit. Is a lot of people like, well, you could eat the leaves too of these plants, right? We know we eat squash blossoms, and we can eat squash blossoms. But people said, this is kind of like almost like an insurance policy when you think about food security. If you're gonna grow like a squash or a pumpkin, you want that plant to work, right? But stuff happens, life happens, right? If you don't get good pollen set, or something eats it, if you could still eat the leaves, that's almost like a true crop run. That's almost like an insurance. And when you think about doing this stuff for food sovereignty and like food security issues, that's really cool. So a lot of gardeners had these crops that they would use had multiple uses, multiple functions, um, which is really nice. See. Oh, seed saving, right? Seed savers exchange. This is stuff that's really interesting, right? And I always love the chance to talk to gardeners who are saving seed or saving seed networks, and this kind of like in situ, seed conservation and stuff. So the ones that were most common, right? There's hard to access, like that spider plant I showed earlier, that lotus, that bamboo. If it's hard to access those seeds, you wanna take care of them. You wanna preserve that. Things that were expensive to buy. There was a couple flowers that people said that, or even from like giant pumpkins, where a seed could cost like 50 cents per seed. That's a thing that's worth saving your seed for. And the next one was stuff that's easy to save seed for. Beans, lettuce, peas, stuff that is a lot simpler to use, especially when you think about like a community garden plot where, back to like those 98 species, there's plants everywhere. It's a lot harder to sort of isolate your stuff to save. Right, and we even had a couple gardeners for some of these culturally relevant seeds. They supply them to other seed change suppliers as an extra source of income, right? So how do all these seeds get to mid Michigan, right? Some of these people say, "Oh, I saw something at a farmer's market, or like at a specialty grocery store, and I tried growing it. I planted it in the ground and see what popped up." There was a lot of people from friends and family across the United States, especially in the southern part of the United States, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, um, especially people of African descent. They said, "Yeah, we have some friends or some distant family members, and we know there's other populations that are really strong in some of these other areas." And when we visit or we travel, we know a friend who goes down there. We've been able to exchange seeds and bring them to Michigan. So there's been a lot of these, like, for these rare crops, yeah, these kind of like informal seed saving networks that now, an institution like the food bank can tap into, and grow these out and propagate it and give them to the gardeners to kind of like ease the burden from a lot of the people. There was some Hopi, Dinner Nation, seeds that people were growing, this nice corn. Right on the left, this is another one. This is called a rat tail radish. People are actually growing it for their seeds, and not just for the tuber of the radish. So like there was a lot of things like this where if they're growing it because you want to eat the seed pods that are nice and green, you could leave a couple of them on the plant to ripen. Another thing that was really important was land tenure, right? Because one of the challenges with the community gardens sometimes can be you could get a different plot each year. Which, if you're a gardener who's going to spend all this time, I mean, I moved across the country for school multiple times, and it's hard to maintain a garden if you're constantly moving. So I can only imagine what they feel like. But yeah, if you have a community garden plot and it changes every year, you don't have as much of an incentive to take care, I don't want to say not to take care of, but if you're gonna go improvements, if you're gonna add some compost, you add manure, you're gonna maybe add some sand, you're gonna broad fork it, you're gonna do all this like heavy lifting. You want to make sure that you're gonna reap those benefits and be in that same space. And a lot of gardeners said, like, I'm really proud. I've been in the same plot 5, 10, 15 years, and look, the soil is totally healthier than it was when I started. Or because I know I'm going to be here, I know I'm going to be close to my friends. The garden becomes this place for community, right? Not just an isolated trip to like the grocery store. And then you would see people, who knew they had land tenure would be in places. They would grow stuff like asparagus or blueberries or strawberries, stuff, rhubarb, stuff that's more perennial in nature. That's only possible through like good relationships with the community garden organizers to know that, hey, I know that next year and I can come back to this plot year after year. And now, those are the kind of the big themes, right? But I think one of the best things is seeing the cool plant. So I'm going to wrap up the presentation, going through some of the really nice quotes and then plants that we saw and things that we learned. So on the left, we have oily bean. Some people call it Chinese oily bean. As you can see, it's a really big, really thick pod. And Joyce, the gardener who grows it a lot, she said she really likes it because for her, it's almost like a full meal, right? You have like the high protein content of the beans, but you're also eating like you get the green pods, nice vegetable. So she's like, if I'm really hungry, or like after a long day of gardening, I can saute up a couple of like beans and I have a whole meal grown on a plant, right? Saga, this spider plant, it's a little bit bitter, but if you see it, Kenyan Congolese people are probably growing it. But we grow them when they're young and add other spices to it, which is really cool, right? Same thing I mentioned earlier with the squash. We were trying to figure out like, well, yes, you say you can eat this, and that's one of the things I struggle with sometimes is if I'm reading, it says, oh, squash leaves are edible. How should I cook them? Right. So a lot of people, sesame oil was a really common thing. You add your aromatics, your garlic, your ginger, your scallions, sesame oil, and saute any types of leaves. Sugarcane, I'm sorry, sorghum was one of those plants that we saw too that, typically we think of sorghum as a grain, right? Kind of like a rice or like a millet, but people used it almost like almost like gum. They would take off some of the strands and chew on it, and they grew it for that and weren't necessarily harvesting the grain. Same thing with amaranth, right? We talk about edible weeds, and we talk to the gardeners like, yeah, but amaranth, where we come from, right? It's been bred. It's a nice hardy crop. So we're not going to bother with the weeds because we have plants that taste so much better. Right, here's one of the challenges, people growing this, dark blue maize, wanting to be ambitious and, mill it down so they can make tortillas. And they're like, wow, we're gonna really need like a lot more space. So that's one of the things we talked about is, thinking about the end goals and potentially needing more space. This one is garden huckleberry. And they're doing this, but yeah, people grow it, but it's kind of flavorless if you just eat it like that. We use it, to make jam. It's kind of like, we know what a grape tastes like, not super grape concentrated flavor, but if you turn that into, grape jelly, grape jam, the flavor is like much more pungent. And this is another thing that they did. And I think it's really cool because, these plants, right, they're smaller, they're annuals. You can grow this and make your own jam
Sorry?
oh, is that a question? We good? Okay. It's okay. I know Zoom sometimes happens. Oh yeah, but it's really cool to have this and not have to have say like your vineyard or have like perennial berry bushes. So that wraps up most of what I'm going to talk about. We have some time for Q&As. So yeah, if you have any Q&A questions, please let me know. Something you want me to elaborate on, something that wasn't clear. Definitely check out the Greater Lansing Food Bank Garden Project. They have a lot of really good resources. And if you work with any community gardens, they have a lot of, really, I think they're a wonderful model to base stuff off of. And if you have questions later, reach out to me. I love talking about plants and soil and all these good things. So yeah, thank you so much for spending your Friday evening here.
All right, Stephen, thank you. Haley, if you'll pop me back up on the screen to joined. Thank you so much. Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much for that. And yes, please go check out the references that Stephen gave and go see all the good work they're doing. Some great material there. Please go look at that. It was, when you started this presentation, it really, 90 community gardens the garden project is working on. I mean, that is a lot. That in itself was happening there. 6,000 home gardeners. I mean, that's quite a project. I mean, the amount of resources and knowledge just in that body is quite a bit. Yeah. So, I loved how you got into you started talking about the different advantages in some of these culturally relative crops. But first, before I get into that, you were talking about what are you seeing, Stephen? Like, so people would like seeds, but some people just want transplants too. I mean, are you seeing that kind of a balance in these community gardens being able to provide seeds, or the mixture of both transplants and seeds?
Awesome. That's a really good question, right? Obviously, everyone likes transplants and wants transplants. What they'll do is sometimes they'll do like kind of like mobile plant pickups or like drop offs. They'll come to the gardens. The thing that's challenging is because it takes more resources to grow out transplants. Gardeners are sometimes limited, so to say, hey, you can take 5 pepper plants, and for some gardeners, they're like, oh, this is great, I don't mind. Like, I probably only want one. Other gardeners consolidated were like, I want 100 pepper plants, right? It's you can't. It's hard to like accommodate each things. So we really try and do the stuff that is harder to grow, that needs a little bit more time. Tomatoes, peppers, squash. Try and do those by transplants and give at least some of them to the gardeners. And your lettuce, your leafy greens, your radish, stuff that you can get away. Direct sowing. Have those seeds available, and people can kind of like pick up. So it is like a mix of both. People definitely want, and one of the themes, like, people want a little bit more transplants, but again, capacity,
Takes
right?
resources and
Takes resources.
capacity.
So that's why a lot of the work is focused on, let's get this specific like banana pepper that everyone's asking for. Let's get that one and make sure we have this and we have enough for these gardeners. And then we can adjust around that.
Yeah. And I guess, Nate is asking, how do you get around the challenges of growing some of these crops? So like if we're in Michigan and let's say we've got, cultures that aren't necessarily in that, I guess you're kind of lucky that you're in the higher, growing zone of Michigan, which those in that 4A, 4B might have even more difficulties. But yeah, when you're working with folks from around the world, coming from different zones, there's got to be challenges in growing some of these crops that even if you've got access to seed, overcoming some of these, climate challenges.
No, that's a great question. So some crops, and people said, you know what, and we this is sort of thing we're gonna have to accept. Some stuff like that needs a much longer growing season. Like I think like taro, cassava, it's just too hard. They're like it's too hard to grow, right? With the climate change and like late frost and early frost and stuff, like we're gonna be spending so much time just trying to get this. Some people, not so much for some of the perennials, if they had like a small fruit tree or something, you could bring that inside and outside. That was more common. So people said like, oh, at my house I might have like a fig tree or like a persimmon tree, something that's not as cold hardy that you can move in and out. A lot of the stuff was, let's see, for some of like the aquatic plants, let me see, it's kind of visible, a little bit hard, right? But you see this kind of like plastic tote. There was a lot of like things like that for plants that were really like water loving. People would actually dig out in the soil, either like line it or kind of like really amend these like concentrated plots to grow a specific plant, right? There's a lot of, going out and covering stuff early in the season, late in the season. But yeah, and I know that's kind of like an ambiguous question, but there's some crops people have tried, like, this is not going to grow. The growing season is too short. Other times, like with the example of this lotus, it's this really, really specific example. And the other strategy has been using the greenhouses that the garden project has to get a transplant out, you should start it to have it spend the first 6, 8 weeks of its life in a greenhouse, and then we can put it out in the ground, come June, honestly, around this time. And just give it like a little bit of a head start on the season without having the gardeners have to buy like shade cloth or row covers or something like that. And that kind of like artificially extends the growing season a little bit. And that's kind of been like the best way, right? It's not perfect. But at least it gives for some of these like sun-loving crops, right? You're not just starting them right now, right? You can kind of like prolong and have them nice, warm. And once they're in the ground, summer, it's hot. It's like 85 degrees this week. These plants are going to be okay. You just have a shorter season.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, folks that come in from places that do have a gardening, farming background and find themselves in a different location, farmers are pretty scrappy and innovative and can, just inherently kind of overcome some of those hurdles. And it kind of reminds me, even, as, Africans were taken and brought to the Americas, and they were taken away from their native greens there. Well, lo and behold, there were collards being grown here and, adapted and, adopted those crops to kind of supplement, cultures that relied heavily on greens. And I do think that, when we're talking about culturally relative crops, it reminds me of my friend Benita Deeb, talks about the importance of these. She's with the Drama Cooperative Farming Alliance and speaks of, the health losses, in particularly Black women, by being disconnected from the bitter greens that were so a part of their culture, that now we see, these bitter greens that would lower blood pressure rates, that would reduce cancer, that and now with that lack of nutrition, there's direct links to infant mortality rates. So by being able to provide those traditional culturally relative greens, those were all leaned on as health things. So I think it's so important that folks are connected and reconnected to those culturally relative crops. And so like you said, when folks are coming over, new Americans, refugees and whatnot, having a support system to kind of get those things going, to they can totally affect health in general. So it's pretty amazing to see a network that can help support that, because it's a vital part of health, right?
Yeah, no, exactly, right? We think about these crops being so nutritious, especially, when they're grown close by, not being transported. And yeah, it's just amazing when you think about those health outcomes too, right? Not just, yes, growing plants, yes, biodiversity, yes, helping their pollinators, yes, all. And sometimes I find myself, as a plant person focusing on that, but we got to take a step back and remember, like, well, yeah, what happens when we eat fruits and vegetables, which can often be. That's one of the reasons I started gardening, is because my parents love them. We're from Texas. They're like, we don't eat rabbit food, like meat and potatoes. That's what's for dinner. And I was like, well, I'll grow it myself, right? And that's just, kind of a small example of, if you don't have access to fruits and vegetables, right, that really impacts, especially when you think about, the way healthcare works in America and stuff, right? Sometimes it's on the burden's on the individual to kind of like maintain health and access to things. So yeah, it's wonderful that they do this work.
Yeah, cliche, but yeah, food is our healthcare system, for sure. Well, hey, I mean, just fantastic work. And, I was going to ask you, I mean, you grew up in Texas. I mean, it's a totally different environment. Are you having fun up there in Michigan?
I'm having so much fun. I mean, okay, so I'm Southwest, El Paso, Texas, West Texas, basically New Mexico. I mean, I love the mountains. I love the desert. I think it's the most biologically diverse desert, in the Western Hemisphere, right? But it's one of those things that you look at and you would say, like, it has a lot of personality, right? It's very different from walking out into a forest and seeing just like being in the trees, being surrounded, or looking over on a lake, or a lake and the woods, right? Just kind of thinking about like a kind of like a national, excuse me, park type stuff, where it's just like, oh, this is just objectively beautiful. You could not care about nature at all, and you think this stuff is beautiful. and I've never seen so much green and so much like water. The desert, though, you look at it and you see all this like sand, and then you see a rattlesnake, and you see a tarantula, and you see all these, every single plant is adapted, so it has thorns and spikes, and it can injure you. Um, right? And you look at it and you're like, wow, this is so cool that like plants survive in this like harsh environment. But it doesn't have that same like wow factor, I think. Um, so yeah, I've just really enjoyed honestly the fact that it rains, and
Yeah.
it's not 120 degrees in the summer. And I think a lot
Yeah.
about, like water security and stuff. And like we're not drawing we're surrounded by 4 Great Lakes. We're not drawing from the aquifers. And people here tend to be, because we have, all the Great Lakes, or 4 of the Great Lakes, people, when I talk about like, oh yeah, I'm trying to prevent nutrient pollution, I'm trying to do stuff with my research that helps plants but also protects water and protects the lakes. I feel like everyone, even if they're not involved in agriculture, could respect and appreciate the need to protect natural resources, which I really, it makes our work a lot easier. It makes it easier to engage with the public, and trying to influence policy and stuff like that. Yeah, so it's a really, really great environment. I also like Texas is great. It's gigantic. The fact that I can, drive across Michigan within a few hours and see a lot of things, as opposed to doing the same distance and going and seeing, just more desert in Texas. It's great. It's wonderful. I love it. It's nice to go home and visit in winter when it's 70 degrees back home and -7 here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you bring up a great point. In the garden, in a garden system, and in those environments, there's just so many human touch points that may not just be vegetables, but it's just so many other touch points when you're just surrounded in nature up there, and all that these community gardens bring beyond just the vegetables. So yeah. So hey, Stephen, again, it was great to have you again. Love all the work that you're doing. I think it's just amazing. I just, yeah, I was kind of thrown, taken aback by how many community gardens are involved with this. And especially when you're working with different cultures. And I know there's indigenous cultures you're working with, cultures from afar, beyond, there's so much, a wealth of knowledge in that community that is able to be shared with everybody else, and the whole community gains because of it. So again, diversity in humans, the diversity in plants, right? It's all a beautiful thing. So Stephen, thanks for all the work, and thanks for taking the time to share it with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it. And I hope you all enjoyed the rest of the conference. It's super cool, 50th anniversary. So, this is wonderful. And yeah, I hope to, connect with you all sometime in the future, wherever our paths may cross.
Yep. Folks, reach out to Stephen. Yeah, again, Stephen, thanks for sharing your work, and thanks for all the fine folks who joined us today. And thank you to this wonderful and engaging audience, and for taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn about all the beautiful work that Stephen's doing and our other presenters are doing in this world. And I also, as a reminder, to help celebrate our 50th anniversary and to continue to support the mission, we're providing participants with a 10% discount with the code VC 2025-10. That's V as in Victor, C as in Charlie, 2025-10. Just visit shop.seedsavers.org to get that discount. But please stay with us and get ready, because up next is a facilitated discussion where you'll be invited to turn on your webcams and microphones for the Green Space Revolution with Brianna Bertacci in about 15 minutes. So stay with us, and thanks for hanging out with us today.